Hey, RetconRaider here. Today I thought we'd take a quick look at another Kickstarter-funded video game that was just released under Steam's Early Access program. Today, I thought we'd talk about All Walls Must Fall by InBetweenGames. So, what is All Walls Must Fall? Well, if I had to describe it in one sentence, I'd say it's an isometric, simultaneous turn-based tactical game with some elements of rhythm gaming, procedural generation, and time manipulation. Yeah, that's a pretty big mouthful. It's essentially a mashup of procedurally generated rhythm-based dungeon crawlers like Crypt of the Necrodancer, combined with the basic turn-based tactical action and cyberpunk setting of games like the Shadowrun trilogy. As with many of the games that I like to talk about, All Walls Must Fall is another crowdfunding success story. The associated Kickstarter campaign was launched earlier this year, raising a total of €36,500, which was enough to fund the basic game, along with the first few stretch goals. But it notably missed the funding needed for several major features, such as the second half of the main campaign and additional playable characters. But more on that in a moment. Since then, the game has seen remarkably quick development, and now, just 4 months after the Kickstarter campaign, the alpha version of the game is already publicly available on Steam. Sales through Steam are allowing InBetweenGames to push forward with the game's development, with the goal of using the sales to help fund the development of additional content. Now, generally speaking, I don't think it's fair to review a game that's still being actively developed, so this is just a general overview of the project. I'll save my arbitrary ratings for when the game eventually hits full release, but for now I'll just stick with talking about the game's setting, the general mechanics, and what the future might hold for the project. From a story standpoint, All Walls Must Fall takes place in the year 2089, in an alternate timeline where the Cold War never ended and the Berlin Wall never came down. Tensions are high, on the constant verge of boiling over into open hostilities, but time manipulation technology is regularly used to keep the peace. The main campaign takes place 10 hours before a nuclear weapon destroys the entire city, with the player taking control of a mysterious operative named Kai. Kai is a cybernetic war veteran and an agent of a mysterious organization known as Stasis. Stasis is the city's final line of defense, employing time-manipulating agents like Kai to prevent disasters before they actually happen, and the game's main campaign revolves around Kai's efforts to foil the nuclear strike that is destined to occur at the end of the night. To accomplish this, he must take on a series of short missions, dancing, flirting, and fighting his way through the streets of both East and West Berlin. The story is told through a series of short, semi-procedurally generated missions that will take the player through every seedy nightclub in the city. Each mission generally has a very simple goal, such as collecting packages, disarming bombs, interrogating suspects, killing enemy operatives, and so on. But each time the player starts a new campaign, the mission sites are randomly generated to increase replayability. Many missions can theoretically be completed peacefully by talking your way past guards, accomplishing your goal, and then quickly leaving the area before reinforcements show up. But more often than not, the player will be forced to defend themselves. This is where the game's combat mechanics kick in. All Walls Must Fall has a combat system that's a little difficult to explain, but that's easy to grasp once you've had a chance to actually try it out. Essentially, the player chooses an action such as shooting, reloading, or moving a single space, and then once they confirm the action, every other NPC on the map simultaneously takes their action as well. The world is briefly frozen between each action, allowing the player to see where enemies are positioned and where projectiles are headed, so they can react accordingly. The player can hunker down behind cover, blasting away at their opponents until their cover has been literally shot to pieces, or they can chaotically weave across the battlefield, literally dodging bullets in a turn-based dance of death. If the player feels outgunned, then they can track down computer terminals that will let them reprogram enemy drones to provide them with some much-needed reinforcements. There's also a small assortment of weapons that the player can unlock throughout the campaign, each with their own tactical advantages, and an upcoming planned weapon modification system. And then, of course, there's the time travel. As an agent of stasis, Kai has access to a few basic but versatile temporal abilities, focused primarily on rewinding time in various different ways. His most basic ability allows him to reverse the clock one turn at a time. Did Kai just walk around the wrong corner and get shot to pieces? Well, no worries. As long as you have some time to spare, you can reverse course and undo what just happened. This can allow the player to quickly undo and redo actions on the fly, both in battle as well as in dialogue. If the player is dead set on avoiding a fight, they can use their ability to rewind time and guess at passwords or redo conversations with guards until they find the magic combination of dialogue options they need to avoid hostilities. The player also uses time to perform other special actions, such as hacking computers or cracking open locked doors. But the player needs to be careful because All Walls Must Fall is a rather unforgiving game. Injuries are permanent and can only be removed by rewinding time to a point before the injury was suffered, and if the player dies, well then they'd better hope they have enough time left to undo that as well, because otherwise the campaign is over. Kai is dead, the nuclear bomb goes off, and Berlin is wiped off the map. Fortunately, the player can refill their time gauge with various actions, most notably by exploring new areas, though they'll also get a smaller amount of time as rewards for completing objectives, talking their way past guards, and defeating foes in combat. But it's also important to remember that, while the entire game technically takes place in turn-based mode, the player is actively encouraged to take their actions in a timely fashion, because if they wait too long between turns, then their time gauge will begin to go down, giving them less fuel for their special abilities. As the game progresses, the player will also be able to unlock fancier powers. One of Kai's powers, for example, allows him to rewind time for everyone but himself. This can allow for some interesting tactics, such as smashing down a wall, an action that would normally turn guards hostile, only to reverse time once you're on the other side. Suddenly, the wall was never broken, the alarm was never triggered, but Kai is still on the other side of the wall, one step closer to whatever objective he was trying to achieve. Conceptually, this makes for a very intriguing game, especially if the developers end up adding in the other characters that they teased during the original crowdfunding campaign, each of whom can manipulate time in a different way. Alev, for example, was intended to be able to freeze time, taking actions while the world was frozen around her, and she was also intended to have the ability to create temporal duplicates of herself, which would carry out one action while she carried out another. Aesthetically, the game has a simple but pleasing graphical presentation, strongly reminiscent of classic 1980s science fiction and cyberpunk properties. The music is, rather fittingly, a constant thrum of pulsing techno, with every action you perform taking place in time with the beat. Overall, it's a game with an intriguing premise and a lot of potential. But it's important to remember that it's also a game that's still very early in development. The version that's currently available on Steam is still in alpha, and while the game is certainly playable, and enjoyably so, it's also very light on content. At the moment, there are a very limited number of graphical assets, with missions all taking place in carbon copy environments, with only the layout changing from one mission to the next. Mission objectives are generally simplistic, with some of the fetch quest objectives becoming a bit too repetitive, threatening to bore the player despite the upbeat tempo. It's also important to remember that at the moment you only have one agent to choose from, and there only seem to be about 3 or 4 different enemies to fight. And of course, at the moment the player can only access Act 1, which restricts them to East Berlin. Unfortunately, while the Kickstarter campaign was successful in getting the game into alpha, it wasn't successful enough to actually secure funding for things like extra playable characters or the second part of the campaign. But based on the developer commentary, it sounds like they're currently moving forward with development on those features anyway. Over the coming months, they plan on regularly releasing new content updates to further expand what the game has to offer. They've already released one prominent patch, making several tweaks and bug fixes based on player feedback, and the next major update, planned for September, will add in skippable tutorial missions, a dynamic hint system, more animations, and more special abilities. Their current plan is to continue adding content on a monthly basis until at least January of next year, but there's no telling exactly what content those future updates might bring. So, some caution might be warranted. This is, after all, a low-budget indie game with an ambitious premise and no clear-cut roadmap for future development. But, personally, I think it's off to a rather promising start, and I've already had a good amount of fun messing around with the alpha build, despite its limitations. If you think it sounds like the sort of game that you might be interested in, then I encourage you to check it out. It's currently available on Steam for about $16 US, with support for Windows, Mac, and Linux operating systems. For those who want a better idea of what the game currently plays like, I'll be using some of my leftover gameplay footage to throw together a quick gameplay video. Nothing fancy, but it should at least be enough to give you a better idea of how the mechanics work. But for now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about All Walls Must Fall, you can find out more about the game by visiting the official website or the original crowdfunding campaign over on Kickstarter. Links are in the description.